Hello and welcome back, future scientists. I'm Mr. K with Mississippi Public Broadcasting, and we're going to continue our lecture today talking about Darwin and his theory of evolution, and I'm going to get into Darwin's theories a little bit today. So thank you so much for making it, and we'll go ahead and get the ball rolling on this. So I wanted to talk about Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. And another name for this that you'll see a lot is evolution by natural selection. And just think about what that's saying, natural selection. What's going on here is that nature is selecting which traits of animals are beneficial and which ones aren't, okay? So the idea here is that all organisms arise and develop through the process of natural selection. Individuals with advantageous traits within a population are more likely to survive and reproduce. When this happens, they pass on those beneficial traits to their offspring. This causes the species to change over time and evolve into new species. So just think about this for a second. Surviving is a big part of this whole process, right? Because if you don't survive long enough to get to the age where you're able to reproduce, then none of your genes get passed on, right? So you have to be fit enough. You have to be strong and agile enough. You have to be able to find food and water and a habitat and a mate. If you can do all of that stuff, you're able to survive well. You're doing a good job in your habitat where you're living. And if you're able to reproduce, then you can pass on your genes to the next generation. Well, what was making you more successful than other people in your population, right? Not everyone's going to make it, right? If you're looking at a population of deer, some deer in that population might die off just because they can't find food and water, right? So there's variation between organisms in a population, right? Not every organism is exactly the same. Even if you were to look across your classroom right now, not everyone in the room is exactly alike. Some people are taller, shorter, stronger, faster. The way your face looks is a little bit different. Your skin color might be a little bit different. So there's a lot of variation in between organisms, right? And some individuals, depending on their variation, some organisms are going to be better at surviving than others. It's just a fact. This is what Thomas Malthus was teaching us with scarcity, right? There's not ever enough for all conceivable wants. So some organisms are going to survive, some aren't. The ones that survive are obviously a little bit better suited for their environment. Well, if they're better suited, if they survive, if they reproduce, then they're going to pass on those advantageous genes to their offspring. And it might just be a little change every generation, but those they will accumulate over time. And you have to remember that most of the time we're talking about evolution, we're not talking about a year or a decade or even a century. We're talking about really, really long periods of time, like almost too much to comprehend. And so those little bit differences, they're going to add up, and that is going to lead to all the diverse forms of life that we see on the planet today. Okay? So let's get into a couple of key points that I really wanted to make sure we hammer down and talk about in a little bit more detail here. So I've already discussed that variation, right? So individuals within a species naturally exhibit variations in their traits. Like I was saying earlier, humans, but this is every organism, right? You can be taller, shorter, faster, stronger. There's differences in between the population, right? That's what variation is. Variation is being a little bit different from everybody else, okay? Well, then another really important part of Charles Darwin's idea of natural selection is inheritance. Remember that these variations can be passed on from parent to offspring through genetic material. And we talked about this way earlier in the year. Think about that meiosis, right? When anything reproduces, you pass on half of your genes to your offspring. And so they're going to get the genes that you give them. So if you have advantageous genes that helped you survive in your environment, then they're likely to get them too because you're passing them on. Okay? Let's talk about this term survival of the fittest. This is an often misunderstood term. So survival of the fittest This is in a competitive environment, individuals with advantageous traits are more likely to survive and reproduce. And I think people understand that survival of the fittest means you have to be able to survive, but a very technical way to think about it, especially in this biology class that I need us to know, is that you have to reproduce in order to be fit. So like one example of this is there are actually a couple of different animal hybrids. So like you maybe have heard of so a donkey, for example, a mule rather. A mule is a cross, a hybrid in between a donkey and a horse. And they have strengths of either one. They're strong like a horse is, but they're easy to train and they don't eat as much food like the donkey does. So they have strengths from either side. But because they're a hybrid, they cannot reproduce. That's just something about hybrids is they're not able to reproduce. So even though this mule is very strong and very durable, because it can't reproduce, its fitness would be zero. You can't pass on your genes when you're like that hybrid. So a very important part of being fit is that you have to be able to reproduce and pass your genes on. If you reproduce a lot, then you would be very, very fit. If you don't reproduce at all, if you don't have any offspring, then your fitness is zero, even if you're the strongest person in the room, right? And then another term here that I really want to talk about is natural selection. So over time, the advantageous traits become more common in a population as individuals with those traits leave more offspring. So again, let's say I am a very strong individual, right? But maybe I die early in my life before I get to that age where I can start reproducing. Well, it doesn't really matter how strong I am. Because I didn't leave any offspring, that strength that I have doesn't get passed on. So it's a very important part of this is reproducing and leaving those genes for the next generation. And this is where natural selection comes in. It's going to select which traits are advantageous. Because you're living out in your habitat, some people are going to be able to find food and water and others aren't. The ones that are able to find food and water, that's going to be the traits that are advantageous. Something is making you better at finding food and water than somebody else, so when you have offspring, you're more likely to leave those traits behind, right? Great, okay, so let's keep it going here. So here are some important aspects of Darwin's theories. These are like some things that might be misunderstood or some misconceptions about his theory of evolution that I wanted to talk about, okay? So one thing that I really need us to know is this term descent with modification. This is the idea that all living organisms share a common ancestor and have gradually changed over generations through evolution. So again, we think that if you go back far enough, you would be able to find one organism that was using cells and had DNA in its cell. That's the last universal common ancestor for all organisms today. So what's that saying is that in a certain way of thinking, you share a common ancestor with every animal on the planet. You share a common ancestor with a fish, you share a common ancestor with not even just animals, but with plants too, right? Because they have cells and they use DNA. So in a certain sense, you could say you're related to a tree or a plant. If you go back far enough, you would be able to find a common ancestor between those two. I know that's kind of weird to think about, but again, you have to realize that this is on a geologic scale. We're talking about millions to billions of years here. This is not something that happens quickly most of the time. Okay? Something else about Darwin's theory, remember the book that he wrote, On the Origin of Species. This is super important. It's probably one of the most important books ever written. This is the book where Darwin first presented his theory of evolution by natural selection. So the thing here is that Charles Darwin is helping us understand the world a little bit better, right? Animals have, and plants, every organism have been doing this for millions of billions of years. He was just the first person to come along and was able to articulate it and put it into a way that is easily understood, right? Another thing I wanted to talk about, and this will really kind of warp your understanding of survival of the fittest. Check out this last term, sexual selection. Okay, so this is a big thing that is driving speciation and evolution by natural selection. So a specific form of natural selection where individuals with traits that enhance their mating success are more likely to reproduce. And a really common example is in birds, and I wanted to talk about this for a second. So anytime, think of a peacock, okay? Think of a peacock. When you think of a peacock, you think about that beautiful blue and purple bird with these huge feathers, right? And just all these different colors, right? Well, those colors and that big tail, you can imagine how that would actually make hunting a peacock very easy, right? I mean, a tiger or a lion, that bird isn't moving around very quickly and it's got no camouflage, right? It's very easy to see, and it's kind of, those big tail feathers are kind of getting in the way. So why would it be around? Well, specifically in birds, what is happening is that the males are trying to attract females, and usually what happens is the males are the ones that are very colorful and bright, because the biggest obstacle they face a lot of the time is not really finding food and water, but finding a mate to reproduce with. And so in peacocks, we see this, this is like an extreme version, right? There's really no reason for that peacock to be so colorful and have these big tail feathers. It makes it harder to get away from predators. It's probably not flying around as well because the feathers are so big. But the reason that we see it today is that having that beautiful plumage, having all those feathers and being that bright color helps to attract a mate. And so this is a form of natural selection called sexual selection, where finding a mate is really the thing that's driving the natural selection and the evolution that's going on. And this isn't just in peacocks, this is in a lot of birds. So anytime, a lot of birds you even see in your backyard, right? When you think of like a cardinal or a blue jay, oftentimes it's the males that are bright and colorful, and the females just kind of have a very average brown looking coat. And that's because the females are the ones that pick who they're going to reproduce with. And so those males are trying to find a mate, and that's why they're so colorful and bright, so it makes it easier to be picked. They're wanting to be selected by the females. And so this is just an interesting part of natural selection. I would say having all that colorful plumage and being, you know, the big tail feathers and stuff, that is not typically what we would say is being fit, right? It's not a strong bird, but the thing that is helping it reproduce is having that beautiful color in the big feathers. And remember that to be fit means the more fit you are means you reproduce often. And so because those peacocks are trying to reproduce and they're being selected for by the colorful feathers, that's what the females want to see. If you have that bright colorful plumage, you're more likely to get a mate and you're more likely to reproduce. Well, then they pass on those genes of having that big colorful plumage, and so that's why it's stuck around so long. So I know some of this stuff can kind of be confusing, but we're going to keep working our way through it, and hopefully it's all going to make sense by the end of it. So thank you so much for being here today. Your teacher has some other work for you to do, so make sure to give that your best effort, and I hope everybody has a great day.